Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome to Conversations. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Greg Weiner, professor of politics at Assumption College, formerly worked here on Capitol Hill for Senator Bob Kerrey and others as well, I believe, right? No one ever works for only one person. Author of 3 books, all very much worth reading, a book on Madison and the Constitution, a book on Daniel Patrick Moynihan, which we'll focus on today, and a very recent book, which everyone should get, Old Whigs, Burke, Lincoln, and the Politics of Prudence. And since you talk about Burke so much in the Moynihan book, maybe we'll come at the end, we could talk a little bit about why you find Edmund Burke so helpful to understand Moynihan, Lincoln, and American politics, since he was a British thinker and statesman. But let's talk about Pat Moynihan, whom you admire, as you say in this book, and I've written, I think, really the first, maybe only biography that tries to really capture his overall thought and work.
Right.
I guess we should say I worked for him, so I feel I'm very interested in this myself, but I suppose not everyone today remembers him. It's hard to believe, 16 years since he died in 2003, left the Senate in 2000. Say a word just about the biography, and then we'll talk about his what you think is most notable for us to understand this major figure in American politics and in American intellectual life.
Sure, and thank you for having me. He's the book tries to capture his political thought, so it's less, not even quite intellectual biography. It's more exegesis of his, mainly of his public writings, but which are vast. He wrote or edited 19 books, and there are hundreds of essays, as you know, and speeches and many things beyond. So there's quite a lot of material to work with.
And so he came to prominence, he was a political aide and got a PhD, but then worked for Averell Harriman and all this, but I guess got known in the very early 60s as a John Kennedy, Kennedy administration official.
Right. So he came, he worked for Harriman in the late 50s and then came as Assistant Secretary of Labor in the Kennedy administration, where he had the title was, I think, Assistant Secretary for Research, which gave him a very wide-ranging portfolio, which was, I think, suitable to his expansive mind and interests. Right. And he did all sorts of things, from working on the War on Poverty to the report on the Black family.
And then went back to ended up teaching at Harvard, and then Nixon's domestic policy advisor.
Right. So he worked for Johnson briefly. Johnson never quite trusted him because he was a Kennedy man and a sort of Northeastern liberal. And Jim Wilson recruited him to run the Joint Center at MIT and Harvard. And during that period, he had some correspondence with Nixon, and at that point, he felt there was a certain ideological exhaustion in the Democratic Party in the late 60s. So it's not that Moynihan's ideas had changed; it's the events around him had. And he saw Nixon as a vehicle forward for those ideas. So he did that. He went back to Harvard for an interval. The story there is that Harvard would grant you a leave to work in government for whatever period of time.
2 years, I think, was the max. Yeah.
Well, his was expiring, and he called the chair of the department and said, "I'm telling the president that I'm resigning." And the chair of the department supposedly said, "Well, the president's going to be very disappointed." And Moynihan said, "No, I mean President Nixon." And the chairman said, "Oh, that president."
That's good. It's too good to check, that story, right? Yeah. And so Moynihan comes back to Harvard, then he's ambassador to India, then ambassador to the UN, where he has a famous stint, which lays the groundwork for his U.S. Senate bid, which I worked on in 1976 in the primary, where he wins the Democratic primary and then defeats Jim Buckley, the incumbent, one-term incumbent, and then is a senator for 24 years, I guess. So that's kind of his overall career. So let's talk about his more his thought, I guess, than what he did in the Senate, which is itself interesting and complicated, obviously, and we can touch on that. But you call it the subhead of the title of your book is The Uncommon Liberalism of Daniel Patrick Moynihan. So, I mean, describe a little bit his liberalism. He was friends with neoconservatives like Jim Wilson, and people thought to be neoconservatives. My father, Jim Wilson, that public interest commentary circle, but always somewhat different in his thinking. friends with the Kennedys, but somewhat different from maybe a typical Kennedy liberal. So
right. So he remained a New Deal liberal all his life. I think that's a very consistent strain. But liberalism changed at some point from what I call New Deal liberalism to Great Society liberalism. And that was something he never, I suppose you might say he was involved in the creation of, but sort of saw very early that it was going wrong. I call it a liberalism with limitation. So it's as opposed to progressivism, which is a permanent, not just faith in progress, but a desire to propel progress. Moynihan had a great appreciation for the subsidiary systems of society, for the complexity of society, the inability to engineer society, and that is a type of liberalism that really has been lost since his death, I think.
And so you would say that New Deal liberalism had remained within that kind of liberal perspective.
He never lost his faith. I shouldn't even say he never lost. He always maintained his faith in government as an agent of improvement. I wouldn't say progress. I would distinguish those. Amelioration, certainly. But the point he made was that the New Deal did what government is capable of doing with respect to poverty, which is collecting money and cutting checks. Which is quite competent at. Social Security has eradicated poverty among the elderly, more or less, and so forth. The problem with the Great Society was that it moved into social engineering. So he quipped once that the net effect of the Great Society was probably to have redistributed income upward, because you were, at least initially, you were taxing poor people to pay middle class social workers to minister to them. So there was the Great Society became politicized very quickly with the community action programs and the idea of empowerment rather than understanding poverty as simply a lack of money.
Yeah, I always thought Moynihan's account, though, of the New Deal, don't you think, is a little white. He's making it something slightly different from what it was at the time. There was a heck of a lot of an attempt at social engineering. If you look at the early New Deal. It kind of got pushed back by the courts and by the system, by Congress, and it ends up being remembered for Social Security and a more kind of, policies that are consistent with a limited understanding of what government can do. I'm not sure that was what they were thinking in 34, 35.
Right. So if you figure as of 38, 39, it changes character, because so many of the engineering attempts have been struck down by the courts and the battles with the Southern conservatives and the Democratic Party. So I think when Moynihan says New Deal liberalism, or when I say it of Moynihan, I think it's more the redistributive aspects than the social engineering aspects.
And so Moynihan is skeptical of the ability of government to, engineer in a complex way policy outcomes, I suppose, and social changing society, so to speak.
So I would say he's not skeptical of changing society. He's skeptical of transforming society, if that's a useful distinction. He quoted Michael Oakeshott once, whose inaugural lecture at the London School of Economics he attended, and
he spent a year or two.
Right? And Oakeshott said something to the effect that politics isn't the art of transforming a society; it's the art of making improvements. He had some criticism of Oakeshott, but I think that stuck with him.
So that aspect is a kind of conservatism to Moynihan, or wariness of social engineering.
Awareness, I would say.
Yeah.
Awareness.
Moynihan becomes famous, I guess, with the Moynihan Report in 1965, which was hugely controversial at the time. An obscure Assistant Secretary of Labor puts out a 80-page or something, somewhat technical, really, government report, right, and it splashes onto the front page of the Times and gets Moynihan denounced and so forth. So say a little bit about that, because that was his. Was that? I guess he'd written articles that were noticed before, and he was known to insiders as a impressive young operative politically and intellectual, right, in terms of the articles he had written already. But that was really his first big public.
It's a really big public controversy, and the report, if you actually read it, is quite theoretically rich. It opens with a discussion of the distinction between liberty and equality and so forth. But the denunciations are curious, because he is, in a sense,
say a word about what the report says,
sure,
first before the
sure. So the report refers to a tangle of pathology in the African American family that is causing accelerating out of wedlock births and the deterioration of the family into what he calls matriarchy and sort of things you're not allowed to say today.
I think the report was called the Negro Family: The Case for National Action.
Well, and the case for national action is often forgotten.
Yes,
right? Because he's
famous for giving the account of this, what he regarded at the time as disastrous breakup of the family, which really meant, I think, unwed mothers. Right, that's really what he focused on. Which, as I recall, maybe I'm wrong about this, that the rate of birth outside of wedlock in the African American community had ascended to 20%.
I don't remember the exact number, but it was a steep ascent, and a very sudden ascent that is now matched,
and happened at a time of progress for African Americans too. So it wasn't as if they were in more distress than they had been. So that was the puzzle, I guess, he saw, right?
Well, one of the other puzzles is that the data sets were from before the Great Society. So it's one of the narratives about the aftermath of the report on the African American family is that Moynihan blamed the Great Society for the rise of dependency and the breakup of the family. It was quite the opposite. He maintained his whole life that there was no proven correlation there or causal relationship.
But it is amazing. I mean, he was very early to see the family breakup question, but of course now 20% is half of the overall national rate.
And the trends are cross racial and ethnic classifications and so forth. I mean, he also noted it was happening across the Atlantic world, regardless of variations in welfare policy, or at least the early.
So it's kind of a cultural and social thing or whatever, I suppose. Yeah.
Right.
But he thought it was a real problem.
Definitely thought it was a real problem. Was one of the first, I wouldn't say the first, but was one of the first public officials to trace it directly to the legacy of slavery. So it's certainly this notion of Ryan's notion of blaming the victim, I think, is reads like someone who didn't read the report.
But I think it was kind of a purposeful left. The left used it as an occasion to attack. I don't know exactly what, since it was a case for national action, and indeed, isn't the report, and even for going beyond a kind of simply providing equal opportunity, because wasn't one of the points Moynihan made that given the problems, you had to give people a hand up who had been disadvantaged in the past.
It leads to Johnson's 65 address at Howard University, where he says that you can't take someone who's been hobbled by chains, put him at the starting line of the race, and say you've been fair. It was quite it was a liberal endeavor on Moynihan's part, and it's been forgotten about that in this whole again the notion of blaming the victim, and about 3 or 4 years ago there was the 50th anniversary, and there was a sort of revival of that kind of rhetoric, and it's a shame that it's not been understood as what it was.
I mean, I suppose you could argue that, since in the book you tend to argue, and let you speak for yourself, but I mean that Moynihan's liberalism is not as common as what you say uncommon liberalism. Right. I suppose the attack on the Moynihan report showed was a moment where the left seemed unwilling to accept certain truths that were just social science truths, really, at that point, and sort of a hard-headed look at what could and couldn't be done, as opposed to just denouncing people who.
Well, this is a period in which the New Left is I suppose it would be the early days of the New Left, but Moynihan had very little patience for the New Left, particularly for the violence and the lack of concern with bread and butter issues. He noted once that the Port Huron statement in '62, I think it was, said nothing about poverty. It was completely addressed to the sort of enemy of middle-class college students who were suffering through a sense of alienation and this and that, but had nothing to say about the disadvantaged.
Which was always a focus of Moynihan's.
Right.
People sort of forget that too, but CBK will come back to these other issues so famous for some foreign policy stuff and for other issues and defining deviancy down and sort of his shrewd cultural analysis. But he always, I think, thought one thing government should do and could do to some degree, if it did it carefully, was actually help people escape poverty, and that was really worthwhile and important.
Yeah, he said once Jimmy Carter had given a speech in which it was, I suppose, an attempt to attack Wright a little bit. And Carter said, well, government can't cure poverty, and government can't do this, and government can't do that. And Moynihan said, well, no, actually, it can't cure poverty. A good welfare bill would do that if you redistribute income enough. What it can't do is provide moral values to people who don't have them, and things of that nature.
And I guess near the end of his Senate career, Moynihan had opposed the Clinton welfare reform bill.
He did, and in a sense on Burkean grounds, on the grounds that there would be unintended consequences, and I think he saw it as an attempt at social engineering. It was just another attempt, like the war on poverty, to kill poverty with a single shot.
Yeah, but on that one, maybe did he come around to accepting that Clinton's bill had been
so he passed away.
Less disastrous than he expected.
He certainly said it had been less disastrous. By the time he passed away in 2003, and it had not, I would say, been fully tested at that point, because the economy had been relatively strong.
Right.
So there continue to be debates about the very bottom. Right? There does seem to still be serious deprivation at the very bottom, but I do think that it's hard to escape the conclusion that some of those warnings were more dire than is warranted in retrospect. I think that's important. In prospect, I think there was a strong element of caution that was appropriate.
I mean, it's interesting because at the time, I remember, Moynihan was viewed as a critic of the existing welfare system, which, famously, he had said this in '65, that paid seemed to encourage and incentivize, or encourage fathers to leave homes, or at least not discourage it or reward, let's just say.
Right.
If you were a mother with dependent children, you got the government check, not if you were a two-parent family.
Right.
And that was one of the things Clinton was allegedly changing, and Moynihan had been a critic of that for so long, but nonetheless, he was worried about, I guess, the abruptness of the change.
The abruptness of the change and the dramatic nature of the change, of taking away the guarantee of support. Moynihan had actually written a bill in 1987, I think it was. One of the dynamics in the welfare reform debate in 95 and 96 was this innovation by governors and so forth. That's traceable to Moynihan. Moynihan wrote a bill that gave governors, the states, I should say, the freedom to experiment on welfare. So he wasn't opposed to that at all. But the big change was from a federal guarantee under the Social Security Act of benefits to people who fell below a certain income level to block grants that didn't rise or fall based on the level of poverty.
I do think Moynihan he always thought government could ameliorate some problems and should act aggressively to do so. I think his first work, you discussed this in the book maybe, wasn't it on auto safety? He sort of was, Moynihan was involved in so many things. He had a sort of zealot,
Yes.
He was like with Ralph Nader before Ralph Nader became famous. Didn't Ralph Nader work for Moynihan?
He hired Ralph Nader, if I'm not mistaken. So the traffic safety thing is a wonderful illustration of his capacity for reconceptualizing problems.
Yeah.
So he looked at it through the lens of epidemiology, because up to that point the conventional wisdom had been that the problem with auto accidents was bad drivers, and by looking at it epidemiologically,
there was a huge amount invested, as I recall, in the mid-late 50s in driver education.
Right.
That was going to really, improve what was then a very high fatality and toll on the highways, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
And he showed that through the epidemiological data that the problem was car design and the lack of seatbelts and so forth. So it's an illustration of the ways in which he could reconceptualize problems. I think that was in many ways his particular genius. So he sees secrecy as a form of regulation. He sees all sorts of things in new ways. So, someone called him a great spotter of ideas. So he had a wonderful flair for seeing things in new ways. Defining deviancy down would be another example of this ability to expand on some insights of others in ways that illuminated things in a new way.
On the auto safety, I think what part of the reason it does seem like his kind of liberalism, as opposed to a kind that tried to change the way human beings think or even behave, really, was look, you can change the cars. You can have seat belts. You can make it required to use them and have a pretty stiff fine for not using them. You can have later airbags and so forth. And so the social engineering side of liberalism, let's make everyone a wonderful driver,
right,
or even make sure no one ever drives when drunk, though you can do that by laws partly. He pushed a little bit aside the sort of, which I think is more the progressive side of things, right? Let's just make everyone behave better,
right?
And instead it was we can actually fix improve the outcome without having excessive expectations from human nature, I guess would be.
Yes, and it was sort of a simultaneously modest and transformative use of data. So he's known as someone who was a devotee of social science, which is true. But one of his most important insights was that social science was better used for evaluating policies than for crafting them. When it was used to craft them, it tended to become utopian and unhinged. But in terms of evaluating things that had already occurred, it could be quite useful.
Yeah, and often it showed you that policies didn't work, right, or had unintended consequences. That was the sort of the old-fashioned use of the term, the neoconservative side of Moynihan, I suppose.
Well, he always resisted that term, as you know. But Peter Rossi, the social scientist, had said that if there was any conclusion from decades of the Great Society and so forth, it was that if I'm getting this right, the expected value of any intervention is zero.
Yeah.
And Moynihan called that Rossi's iron law.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. It is. In Moynihan, we looked at an awful lot of programs in that light, and I think found that they didn't work as they were supposed to.
Right, often because they weren't integrated. He referred to policy liberalism versus program liberalism, and programs were these discrete efforts to intervene in social or economic life that were not connected. So he, as opposed to policy liberalism that attempted to attack problems in an integrated way that respected the complexity of both the problems and of the society. So the family is an example of that. He thought that there was a need for a family policy, not for discrete programs.
No, I first really got to know Moynihan when I came in between high school and college to work for him as a very, very junior, literally opening envelopes kind of job in the Nixon White House in 1970, and he was pushing the Family Assistance Plan. Well, pushing it, they had developed it, they had submitted it, it was a piece of legislation. I went to some of the hearings that were held on it that summer as it got killed, actually.
Right.
More by opposition from left and right, I guess.
Got squeezed between the two.
So say a word about what that was and what the idea behind it was. And
the Family Assistance Plan was essentially a guaranteed income, an idea that had first been developed by Milton Friedman, actually. So the idea was that it would incentivize work, because the more you worked, you wouldn't lose benefits by working, but he had also noted that the wage system didn't take account of family size and so forth. So it was, but more or less, was a guaranteed income. It, in my mind, is a bit of an outlier in Moynihan's career, because it is a large, prospective, transformative effort.
It would have replaced a lot of the other.
Would have replaced virtually all the
Wow.
other welfare programs. So, but would have, he noted at one point that if a third of the money that had been spent on the Great Society had been spent on giving money to poor people, there'd be no more poverty in the United States, at least understood as material deprivation. But it is curious that it's I would say the one instance in his career of a truly prospective, large-scale, transformative change, or attempted a change. It got squeezed to death, as you note. Although there's a scene in when he's in the Senate in 1976, 77, it would be 77, I think, where he was holding a hearing on welfare reform, and there had been some experiments in Seattle and Denver on controlled experiments on a guaranteed income. And the supposedly is a Perry Mason moment where the results come into the room while he's holding the hearing, and they showed that it was increasing family dissolution. And this has since been disputed. This data has been gone over 101 different ways. But he wrote a letter to Buckley that was published in the National Review saying we were wrong about the guaranteed income and it's calamitous and that's the state of social science right now and we're bound by it.
I mean, I suppose in 69, 70, it seemed to the Nixon administration and to a lot of people that the Great Society had been such a sort of fiasco, or at least hadn't worked out as people hoped, and the case for sort of cutting the Gordian knot and doing something bold, which had sort of Milton Friedman-like support on the right, and some support among liberals, because it was generous. I think it would have perhaps resulted in more actual money in the wallets of poor people. You can see why Moynihan might have been tempted for that.
Absolutely, and it was I don't want to say it wasn't sort of a professorial concoction. It was the result of at that point many years of reflection on the welfare system.
I mean, I suppose I said before that the Moynihan Report was when he really became famous, but he had become pretty well known, now that I think about it for a second, with his work with Nathan Glazer on ethnicity and Beyond the Melting Pot, which comes out in early 60s, as I recall.
I was going to say late 50s, but somewhere in that
but
neighborhood.
Before.
Yes.
And that was a continual interest of his, too. It is amazing how many issues he wrote about and worked with other people on, whether it was, and other intellectuals were very well known, Jim Wilson, Nat Glazer.
Right.
But say a word about the Beyond the Melting Pot. Was that book?
Well, the notion of Beyond the conclusion, I should say, Beyond the Melting Pot is that what was called the liberal expectancy, which was that all the ethnic groups would melt together and ethnicity would disappear in a free society, had simply not happened. He wrote in the conclusion, Moynihan wrote the conclusion, and he wrote the point about the melting pot is that it did not happen, that ethnicity was persistent, and I think persistent in some ways valuably, that it could be, when Moynihan tended to quote Burke's dictum about little platoons that connect us to the larger society, he tended to mean ethnic groups. He did say once that there was some potential for tragedy in all this. But I think that was what enabled him to foresee the dissolution of the Soviet Union, is that early work on ethnicity, or at least the manner of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He had said not to get ahead, but he had said in 1979 that the Soviet Union will break up along ethnic lines within a decade.
And here in America, I mean, how was Beyond the Melting Pot taken? Was it I guess it became sort of accepted wisdom over
It did become
time.
Accepted wisdom and was commonly used, as I understand it, as a textbook in college classes for quite a long time. One of the wonderful things about Moynihan that I think is a lost, it is true Glazer too, that is a lost art in academia is the learned generalization. That you observe facts and you draw general conclusions. And I think if you tried to put Beyond the Melting Pot is justly a classic. And I think if you tried to get it through a dissertation committee now, they'd want to see the regressions and the counterfactuals and so forth. So it's become very hard to generalize.
Now, when I think with Moynihan, this was very true personally of him, as he was such a lively character and a lively mind. But there was the kind of play of mind that you don't see that much in social science these days. I mean, not the kind of earnest attempt to be pseudo-rigorous and prove X, Y, or Z. And
in the narrower and narrower specialization.
Willing to speculate based on data and based on history and understanding. But
well, and that I think was informed by his intervals in public life and eventually his wholesale devotion to public life. One of his wonderful aphorisms is that in academia, the imperative is publisher perish, and in politics, it's speculator perish.
That is good. I think a book of his essays was collected, just to stick on domestic policy for another minute, and then we have the foreign policy stuff is very interesting also, obviously. In 73, I remember this came out, I think, when I was in college. I think it was called Coping.
Coping
which is a
wonderful title.
Yeah, isn't it? It really captures the spirit of that kind of liberalism, I guess you'd say, right?
Right. The introduction to that book is about 50 pages, and I think is his most extended, focused reflection on politics as a phenomenon.
Well, that's good. I haven't looked at that in a long decades.
It's quite good. And one of my favorite passages is because he's reflecting on the excess hopes of the 1960s at this point, particularly the late 1960s. And he says, suppose that he rewrites Kennedy's inaugural address. And he says, suppose that Kennedy had said, so let every nation know that we would be crazy to bear any burden and oppose any foe and support any friend and so on and so forth. He says there would have been no inspiration in this. There might also have been no Vietnam.
So don't try to do too much.
Don't try to do. Be measured and thoughtful about what you're doing. And don't cast things in absolutes. Right. He would later say it is a much different context, but. The first President Bush had said there was no price too great to be paid for liberating Kuwait, to which Moynihan responded, well, there's an excellent case to be made for liberating Kuwait, but it's absurd to say there's no price that's too high to pay for it.
Now, Moynihan became famous again, you might say, on the foreign policy stage more as ambassador to the UN in 75-6, arguing against the Zionism as racism resolution, of course, in the General Assembly, and writing articles and being somewhat different in tone from Kissinger, who was then Secretary of State, and didn't, I think, much like Moynihan's.
That's right.
Moynihan was a very early advocate of putting human rights and democracy at the center of American foreign policy. That I remember, being in grad school and thinking, well, that's pretty striking. Before Jimmy Carter, Moynihan would have did it a somewhat different way from Carter, but.
Right. George Willis said that a few years after Moynihan, Reagan was calling the Soviet Union the evil empire, and that one may have been connected to the other. The UN career starts with a wonderful article and commentary called "The United States in Opposition," and that's another example of reconceptualizing a problem, because I think he felt we had sort of fallen into a pattern of apologizing for ourselves and trying to manage the criticism at the UN and so on and so forth. He said, look, there's a parliamentary system here, and we're the opposition party. The free nations are the opposition party now. And we have to act like that. And the greatest power of an opposition party is rhetorical.
To speak up for freedom.
To speak up for freedom, right.
Which he did more than Kissinger wanted, I think. And
I think definitely more than Kissinger wanted. Kissinger said that Moynihan didn't understand, I forget the exact phrase, but the realities of the environment or something like that. So Kissinger, for example, said that the way to handle the Zionism as racism resolution was to kill it quietly through the parliamentary process, and I think Moynihan saw it as the evil that it was.
And Moynihan, I remember when he ran for the Senate in 76, he also was a Scoop Jackson delegate to the Democratic Convention.
Right.
He ran as a Scoop Jackson delegate. I don't remember if he actually went as a Jackson delegate. I'm not sure Jackson won at that point. By the time of the New York primary, I'm not sure Jackson was still much in the race in 76. But he always thought of himself, I think, as a Scoop Jackson Democrat.
I think so. I think Norman Podhoretz tells the story of Jackson calling him and saying, "What can you do something about your friend Moynihan?" Because this is in the late, I guess at this point it would be the early '80s when Moynihan had concluded the Soviet Union was going to collapse of its own weight, and Jackson at that point wasn't. At that point and no other point was on board with that. Jackson is another example of someone who was a Cold War liberal in the classical New Deal sense of the term.
Yeah, Moynihan, I remember when he came to the Senate, he disappointed a lot of us who were sort of hawkish Scoop Jackson Reagan types, because he was analytically very strongly for freedom and for the U.S. having an important role in the world, but he also wasn't particularly fond, as I recall, of Reagan's military buildup and of the wars in Central America and of the kind of faith in the military and the CIA. He was a skeptic, and then he did have this unusual analysis, which turned out to be very prescient, I guess, of the weakness that the Soviet Union was much weaker than we all thought.
So he saw demographic data in the late 70s showing that the life expectancy, as he said, was nearly impossible, was declining in the Soviet Union, and that was enough to convince him that the Soviet Union was a spent idea. He gave a commencement address in the early 80s that said that what we have yet to realize is that the Cold War is over and we won. Right? The Soviet idea, he said, is spent. It commands. It has. So there's some fear, but it commands no loyalty. He said history is moving away from it at astounding speed. And he said, let's just let it happen and be here, our old selves, and be able to say that freedom did indeed prevail.
I guess the critics would say that the Reagan buildup and other things helped that along more than maybe Moynihan would have said. He was a big critic of the intelligence community, right, and CIA, and
he was.
He was also prescient given various mistakes that they made later.
Right, they've completely failed to foresee the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he used to say that in his, I think it's in his book Secrecy, that the Foreign Service exam, up until the Soviet Union collapsed, if there was a question that said which is larger, the East German economy or the West German economy, if you answered the East German economy, you got a job in the Foreign Service, and if you answered the West German economy, then you got a job in finance and went on to great. That
was the official government statistics.
That was the official
East
statistics.
Germany was doing better than West
Germany.
Germany.
Right, and he said you could ask any cab driver in Berlin, and they could tell you that which was bigger.
He was willing to be contrarian on a lot of things. I mean, that was impressive.
He was. I think and this is an important role that senators play. There are certain kinds of senators play as the gadfly role. So he was, I would say, he was more or less a critic of every president with whom he served. That's not to say there was any inconsistency in his own ideas, but was certainly a critic of Carter. Of the Reagan military buildup after he had concluded that the Soviet Union was destined to fail of its own accord. Certainly never got along with.
And there was other aspects, like of Reagan's Central American policy and stuff. He was not.
Well, he was a devotee of international law, which had fallen out of vogue. Right. Reagan had said at one point that a nation has a right, if it's in its interest, to take actions that it feels are necessary. That was with respect to the mining of the Nicaraguan harbors to prevent interference in El Salvador. And Moynihan said that was a completely normalist statement, to say you have a right to do whatever you believe serves your interest.
Anyway, you're going on, so I interrupt you. So Reagan, he had I think respected Reagan, and I remember when I came to Washington in '85 to work in the Reagan administration, everyone on our side of the Reagan administration was throwing around Moynihan's comment from '80 or '81 that the Republican Party suddenly has become the party of ideas, right. which was a nice tribute, and maybe he did it more to get the Democrats to rethink things than out of genuine praise for Republicans, but there was some genuine respect, I think.
Genuine respect, and one of Moynihan's wonderful characteristics was he was always drawn to the company of people with whom he disagreed. He was fond of quoting Lionel Trilling, I think it was, who said that when liberalism was an unchallenged ideology, it was not doing itself any favors by shutting down criticism, that it needed the benefit of thoughtful opposition.
And then just to run through the presidents, that's kind of interesting. George H.W. Bush, Moynihan respected, I think.
I think did respect, and there's I would say less there. I mean, first President Bush spoke in at least the argot of international law, the New World Order and so forth. And I do think Moynihan respected that.
And I think the kind of institutionalism of Bush would have appealed to Moynihan. But I remember working for Quayle. I was Dan Quayle's chief of staff, Vice President Quayle's chief of staff, and we had the big vote on the first Gulf War after Saddam invades Kuwait, and we sent all those troops to Saudi Arabia. And it was the Democrats controlled Congress, as you know. And we had a pretty big margin in the House, though. There were an awful lot of old-fashioned, kind of hawkish Democrats who weren't going to not vote to authorize war when Saddam's sitting there and threatening Saudi Arabia. We had all these troops over there already. But the Senate was closer. I mean, the majority leader was pretty firmly against it, as I recall. And I remember Quayle saying to me, "Can't you do something with Moynihan?" And I said, I don't think I'm going to change Pat Moynihan. I think I went to see him. I mean, just as a kind of, I had the closest relationship to him, I suppose, of people in the Bush White House. So I did my duty, but I didn't convince him of it. But I think only something like 8 Democrats voted for the authorization. But it's funny that Moynihan, for all the sense I think people have generally of hawkish, Scoop Jackson, standing up at the UN, which is all true. He was pretty cautious on the use of force, and not quite, where a lot of us were actually on that range of issues. I guess we would say that he didn't understand how important the actual threat or use of military power is to back up the things he cared about. He would have said we were being maybe reckless or.
Well, and remember, he was his sort of consciousness about this was formed with the power of rhetoric, the power of rhetoric in defense of freedom, which is a much not antagonistic to, but is much different from the pursuit of force. I find the vote against the first Gulf War one of the harder things to explain. The reason I say that is not because I find it surprising that he was cautious. I think that was his natural and in some ways Burkean disposition, but there had been so much infrastructure of international law built around that, going through the UN system and the enormous coalition and so on and so forth.
Yeah, you would have thought that Secretary of State Jim Baker's efforts he went out of his way to not have this be kind of arbitrary and us alone, and we had a huge alliance, and we had UN Security Council authorization and all that. So it'd be worth going back and look. I assume Moynihan must have given a speech on the floor of the Senate, I guess. Most of them did. I don't know.
I'm sure he did. I can't recall what he said. What I do recall, in this, actually perhaps this was from the speech, was the line about the objecting to Bush's sort of unmeasured rhetoric. Right.
And I don't think he had a very high opinion of the Kuwaitis as they were the victims of Saddam, but they were themselves a sort of semi-tyrannical, oligarchical, little kingdom. And why are we going all this? It's not like we're defending democracy or anything there. Right. So, or that we were going to impose democracy. He correctly saw that Bush would stop short of that, I suppose.
Right.
It is amazing to have, and then secrecy. Say a word about that, because he was really quite possessed of that. I remember when I would see him in the 90s, he was really
right. He wrote a wonderful book about it, and he again reconceptualized the problem. So that he said secrecy was a form of regulation. That in domestic regulation, the government says what you can do, and with respect to secrecy, it says what you can know. And that secrecy, at least excessive secrecy, almost always led to poor conclusions and bad policies, to the point where he, at one point, I think perhaps to make a point more than meaning for it to pass, suggested abolishing the CIA and folding it into the State Department and starting over.
I think, and he thought the whole classification system had just gotten totally out of hand. And
it took completely out of hand. He gave numbers on the annual classification, and it was extraordinary and politicized. Right, being used to, and in some ways you could say he was prescient with the sort of breakdown of those structures in predicting 9/11.
Yeah.
Right. He described secrecy as a form of hoarding and bureaucratic power and.
So the compartmentalization, which meant the FBI couldn't talk to the CIA and all that, I suppose. Right. And then, of course, with the failure on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, was maybe also kind of too much talking to each other and accepting certain analyses, which when you go back and uncover them, really it's someone's conclusion at some junior level of the CIA based on some intercepts or some extrapolations that aren't necessarily correct. Right.
And if my memory is correct, he passed away the day that the invasion of the invasion.
It was around then. Is that right?
It was the day or right around the day. So we don't. I think we can speculate on what he would have, on what he thought, but there's not a long record.
What more broadly, I think. A couple of things on his liberalism. Some of the famous things he did were, quote, conservative, sort of. The Moynihan Report, the Zionism speech, defining deviancy down. Now, that was, 92, 93, something like that?
Somewhere in there, yeah.
And that article had a huge splash.
Right.
And what was the sort of point of that?
The point of that was that society has a certain level of deviance that it can tolerate. And when that threshold is exceeded, we define deviancy down. We just redefine previously impermissible conduct as now acceptable. And he said that's done altruistically, by people who want to sort of excuse the conduct of others, but it's also done for the purpose of protecting society. There was I believe, a sociologist, I want to say Kai Erikson, who he quotes in that article, who had done research on the Puritans and the degree to which Puritan moral standards changed. And as Moynihan characterized it, he could often characterize other people's research better than they had themselves, was that the degree of moral regulation more or less aligned with the supply of whipping posts.
But he thought it was a problem that we were standards were kind of just increased. People didn't want to be judgmental, and so they were not upholding standards, and that this was a hard thing to fix once you went down that path, I suppose.
Yes, I think that's right. Now, I think he would dispute the idea that was a conservative notion. It's become more, I think perhaps the moral language has become more aligned with conservatism contemporarily. But I think he would understand that. He spoke often of the liberal tradition of respect for facts, right, which is a sort of a Burkean tradition as well. So I suppose the label is less important than that commitment.
He had a wonderful line, which I think was playing off other people at the time who were saying culture was so important and so forth, which goes something like what? The central conservative truth is that culture determines the success of societies. The central liberal truth is that politics can change culture. I don't remember exactly where he said that.
Can change a culture and save it from itself, right? That was in his, I believe, in his Godkin lectures, which were published as Family and Nation in the mid-1980s. There's a line that comes right after that is often forgotten, and it's witness the civil rights legislation of the 1960s that Republicans so opposed. And the reason that line is important to me is it gives real meaning to what it is for politics to change a culture, because he noted that for all the things that were frustrating about the 60s, that's one clear example of government success. Right? You open the 1960s with what amounts to a caste and class system. It's not completely changed. It's obviously not eradicated by the end of the 1960s, but the legal infrastructure is certainly completely changed by that point.
Yeah, no, we never. I mean, it's important. That's an important point you make, that one shouldn't make him too much of a conservative, sort of after the fact at all. He held them in balance. I think you say this in the book, in 1967 or 8, so this is the New Left is going strong. Moynihan's out of government at this point at Harvard, looking at the chaos of kind of the life in America in 68. Doesn't he sort of call for a liberal-conservative alliance almost of the center against the extremes of both right and left?
He certainly was deeply concerned by the New Left, and particularly by the violence of the New Left. And I think in some ways, not the violence quite, but we're seeing a resurgence of that dynamic on the left now of ever moving further and further in a sort of a process that has its own logic.
And on the right.
And on the right, yes.
Which was true of the 60s, too. One forgets, Goldwater became a, well-respected elder statesman, and he lost by 20 points, and no one had to actually live with a Goldwater administration, and some of the people who were hanging around Goldwater and the Birch Society and so forth. But one forgets how much extremism was around in the 60s on both sides, and semi-respectable, I guess you'd say, and semi-fashionable, really.
Right.
And Moynihan really... And that is Burkean. I mean, to be very, very distrustful of both of those, right?
Of both extremes and of the sort of suddenness of this and really without Moynihan opposed the Vietnam War, but mainly because it was distracting us from other foreign commitments that could be more productive. He had said at one point that one of his complaints against President Carter was that he continually framed Vietnam in a way that made us culpable rather than merely fallible. And so it was based on, he called it once a mystique of youth, right? That the liberal, he said the liberal belief in things like due process and things that are maybe less sort of attractive, but or less headline worthy, shouldn't be frittered away, he said, in deference to a mystique of youth.
I mean, it's amazing, just how, again, coming back to how many things he was involved in. He was ambassador to India, a country he had some interest in, and I guess fascination with. I don't really know why or how, but anyway. was the world's largest democracy, as he liked to say.
Right.
And I remember those of us who I knew him at the time, I'd worked for him before he went to India. And it was sort of, we all thought, well, that was, Nixon was, there's nothing left for him to do in the Nixon administration. And in fact, the Nixon administration was going down the tubes, basically.
Right.
And it was a way for him to get out of the country and do some good and be an ambassador, which what's not to like. And he was so interested in cultures and art and architecture and all that. He would love being in a place like India with all that. I think we underestimated, I certainly did, how important he thought it was, actually, that the two largest democracies get along better than they had. We had tilted towards Pakistan, I guess, in '71, and in the conflict that led to Bangladesh. So
right,
again, I think he was sort of way ahead of everyone. And now it's taken for granted. The U.S.-India, a very important relationship, and it's developed under Bush and Obama. But this was way back in '73, I
73,
guess, 74. Yeah.
By the way, Liz Moynihan became a leading authority on, I think it's Mughal architecture, which she remains today, or landscape architecture. I want to say I made that wrong. But he negotiated the largest debt relief for India, and tried for several years to get the Guinness Book of World Records to record that he had written the largest check in history. But I think the Indian experience was probably central to that article, "The United States in Opposition," because he saw this sort of casual, almost reflexive socialism that was descending from these. Everyone had studied at the London School for Economics and had gotten these ideas from the same places, and I think that was central to that
and India
set of ideas.
Prided itself from Nehru on as being the leader of the non-aligned nations,
the non-aligned
third
nations,
world,
right.
and all that. And
Right.
I think Moynihan didn't think that was he thought they should be with the West against the Soviets, right? I mean, that was an attempt to clarify that situation.
Right.
You worked on the Hill when Moynihan was a senator?
I did. I worked for Bob Kerrey, who was Moynihan's closest friend in the Senate for those years. They had met when Kerry, as a governor, was working on welfare reform.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that.
I met him, quote unquote, met him. I mean, it's not as though we were acquainted, but I met him when we had. Don't let me get too far afield here.
No, go ahead.
But Kerry was working on entitlement reform, and had a Social Security bill that had three sponsors on it, including himself. It was Al Simpson and I think Chuck Robb, and which Moynihan then took up in I think a very courageous way. But we had developed. This was before PowerPoint became the rage. But Kerry was going around and making presentations to colleagues, and one of his proposals had been that we give everyone a $1,000 retirement account at birth, so that there'd be compounding interest that would catch up with the sort of shrinking Social Security benefit. So if you recall, there was the dancing baby that was all the rage in the 90s on the internet. And somehow this ended up in this presentation, and so one day I was with Kerry in the Capitol. He saw Moynihan, pulls him over and says, "You got to see this." And my clear recollection is Moynihan, all 6'5" of him, sauntering off, muttering, "Well, I'll be gosh darned to him." So it was not exactly what he said.
Right.
From everything I understand from people who worked for him, very amiable and demanding and alternating.
Many of my friends went to Washington to work for him because the world, Harvard grad students, that was an obvious recruiting pool for him. He had taught there. He had many friends like Jim Wilson and Nat Glazer who were there, who would send their best students, or Harvey Mansfield and others, and foreign policy people too, Sam Huntington. And he was a tough boss, I think, slightly, kind of one of those, he would have an idea, call you up. I mean, they're all a little like this, right? At 3:20 in the afternoon, and I read something somewhere. Check it out. And this is pre-internet, of course. You could just Google, right? So, check this out, find out what the truth is, and get back to me at 5. And it was like, I don't know if I can, but he had been in government as a young man, and I remember him telling me this too, that I was saying something was hard to research. So we'll call up the people who know. So you can't just call. I don't know. Don't you have to go to the library and look things up? You can't just call up people. But he had actually, this is an advantage, I think, of working in government when you're pretty young. You realize, of course, the advantage is that if you're working for Governor Harriman and you call, people hop to it and are happy to help you. You call the leading expert at Columbia on X, right, on auto safety, and he'll answer your call, take your call. And I think Moynihan, but of course, it's true if you're an aide to Pat Moynihan too. But I think it's a hard thing to train people. That you have more ability to get information than you think because you just came out of grad school where you would trundle off to the library to look things up.
Well, I would think particularly given the fertility of his mind and the fact that he was fascinated by so many different things.
So he was very impatient with people telling him when they didn't have someone was.
He this is slightly before my time, but he was the only co-sponsor of a healthcare bill that Kerry had introduced in 91, 92, something like that. And they had a press conference in Moynihan's office. And as I heard it described, it was like a graduate seminar. Everybody was sitting in a circle. All the reporters were sitting in a circle. And every once in a while, he'd point at one and say, "I notice you haven't asked a question yet."
Yeah, that's funny. Talk more broadly about his liberalism. I think that really is such, for those of us here in the summer of 2019, uncertain about the future of conservatism or whether it does have a future or should have a future, uncertain about liberalism too, given what's happening on that side of the aisle. Moynihan really does seem to stand out, I guess, and then to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so a liberalism that respected limits in multiple senses. The social organism was complex and couldn't be re-engineered, but could be improved and could be and ills could be ameliorated. He had a great respect for the Catholic principle of subsidiarity, which is that you solve a problem at the level closest to the source, so as to strengthen local institutions. He distinguished also between statist liberalism and pluralist liberalism. So he was very disturbed. I think it was George McGovern at one point said it was hedonistic to not want essentially more of a role for the state in addressing social ills. When he was disturbed by that because there was a great role to be played by trade unions and ethnic groupings and all sorts of subsidiary institutions that were a buffer between the individual and the state. And that's another, by the way, example of his belief that politics could change a culture. So he would, for example, he argued for many years. I think Bob Packwood was his co-sponsor on this, for what they called an above-the-line deduction, so that you could deduct charitable contributions even if you didn't otherwise itemize. He fought for many years to make parochial school tuition deductible and so forth. So a great belief in those subsidiary systems of society, and I think a great distrust of ideological politics. He was asked once, I think by the New York Times, what is politics? How he describes politics. And he said, well, I was never a Stalinist and I was never a Trotskyite, which of course was in his youth was one of the great divisions. He said, I guess if I had to say, then he interjected, and I don't have to say, but you asked, I would say lack of ideology.
Really? But at other times he said he was a liberal or a proud liberal, I think, right?
But not in a. I mean, definitely a proud liberal. I mean, that I think he was unrelenting on. But not in the sense of an ideological blindness.
Right. I do think I've thought myself about, could one reappropriate the term liberal, which since the progressives don't seem to want it, and conservatives, God knows what conservatism now means. So, and liberal has a great tradition, and also it's still used in ways that are very favorable and capture, I think, something of what is best about being a liberal education, liberal democracy, a liberal world order. These are all good things, right? So for conservatives and sensible liberals alike, and I think he would have been very attuned to that meaning of liberal, but skeptical of liberalism, I suppose.
Or progressivism in particular. I think this switch from liberalism to progressivism is quite significant because it's hostile.
You had a good piece on that a couple of years ago, or just a year ago in the Times.
Something like that, yeah.
When did that happen, do we think, incidentally?
It seems fairly recent to me, and I don't know that I can demonstrate that, but I think it began with the sort of Dukakis and the discrediting of the word liberal and people being afraid to embrace it. So I think progressivism became the label du jour. But the problem is that ideology carries a lot of baggage with it, including, I think, an inherent hostility to moderation. Because if what you're in favor of is progress, people in the way who are always retrograde, and you can never have enough. More progress is always better.
And I think hostility to pluralism, which he really cared about. I mean, it's funny, that's a term that's used so little these days. It was a big term in my sort of college and grad school days. I think people wrote books about pluralist democracy and so forth, but it's not so fashionable. Progressives never liked it. They didn't like it in 1920, It's messy, complicated.
It's messy, it's complicated, it's unpredictable, and it's uncontrollable, right? Which is part of the joy of it.
Yeah.
Moynihan actually, and I think perhaps in too belabored of a sense, drew if not a straight line, at least a connection between the liberalism of Mill and the liberalism of Roosevelt. So he saw a continuous tradition there. There's probably Mill was more of a progressive, I think, than is generally appreciated, but certainly there's a big difference between the sort of caricature of Mill as a libertarian and the liberalism of the 1930s.
And Burke, I mean, so I want to talk about Burke, but did Moynihan himself talk about Burke much? Or?
Moynihan quote, I don't know of any, I would think of this in terms of an affinity, not a causation. He did, in my notes of Moynihan, he quotes Burke about a couple dozen times. So enough that it's clear that he read him, but he's certainly not a Burke scholar. Certainly never described himself as a Burkean. I think drew on Burke's wisdom in the same way that he drew on a lot of people's wisdom.
So talk about Burke, since you mentioned him, though, you call Moynihan, I think, a Burkean liberal. Right. And then you have the new book on Burke, and you explicitly have a whole section on half the book's on Burke, Burke and Lincoln, which is very fascinating juxtaposition, since Lincoln doesn't seem to have known anything about Burke.
I seem to have a proclivity for associating Burke with people who we don't know.
But talk a little bit about why you find Burke a useful guide to American politics, especially to American politicians whom you admire, and maybe we all admire.
Right. I think Burke most fully, at least since Aristotle, theorized the virtue of prudence as an ability to distinguish between Aristotle calls it the ability to choose the proper means to right ends, and Aquinas as well. Burke gives it a moral component that is based on the limits of human reason, and I think we live in an age where there is an unbridled faith in reason and science and technology and so on and so forth. And it is when injected into the political sphere, that's given to exactly what Hayek called the fatal conceit. The idea that everything can be engineered. So Burke spoke of he said his forefathers, meaning his British forefathers, had a moral rather than a complexional timidity, that it was rooted in a respect for the limits of human reason. And that's something I think we've substantially lost. One thing that one of my favorite Moynihanisms, and I can't recall the context, but he said, if you want to know the difference between the United States and the Soviet Union, read The Federalist and read Lenin, because the Federalist refers back to things that have already occurred and lessons that can be drawn from them. In Lenin's writings are all about the future state of the world.
Yeah, that's good. And Burke, as you point out, especially the new book, I mean, he's a reformer, but also he's supportive of the American Revolution, much more than most British politicians, hostile to the French Revolution, supportive of various reform efforts. I mean, he was a Whig. He wasn't a status quo defender of every aspect of aristocratic government. He wasn't he was a reformer on Ireland, on the Catholic Church in Britain, India. But very important that the British Empire be governed in a, liberal way, let's call it that, maybe, and not in a harsh and unjust and exploitative way.
Right.
That impeachment of Hastings he pursues for years.
7 years, I think it was.
Which ends up, and people don't understand why he's obsessing about it, but
I
think he thinks it's very important as an example, right? If you're going to become an imperial power, you can't set the precedent that it's fine to do anything.
Right, and that's the speeches on Hastings contain some of his most eloquent defenses of international, what we would today call international law. But I think he used the phrase the law of nations. Burke was very skeptical. I think what the difference he saw between the French Revolution and the American Revolution is the American Revolution did not seek to uproot all sorts of all social institutions. So as I've explained this to students before, the old story about Rip Van Winkle. If I'm getting my stories right, takes a nap and wakes up after the American Revolution and doesn't know what's going on. That's really not the case. If you had slept through the American Revolution, you wake up the next day. Certainly, the political arrangements are a little bit different, but you're not living in a fundamentally different society. The French
they put, even in the Declaration, for all the abstract truths, which are extremely important, I would say, it's still the justification is that the king is violating various practices,
traditional rights, right, and
so that they're restoring to some degree,
it's
the rights of Englishmen and so forth. Yeah.
Right, and Burke says when I reform, it would be in order to restore, or to. So, I think the complaints are the most overlooked part of the Declaration. Moynihan, one of the things Moynihan notes about Burke and about the French Revolution is the reordering of the calendar. The revolutionary calendar, the 1792 becomes year one, and they have to reorder the days of the week. And I think Burke saw before that point, but sees how this is going to go south and how it's fundamentally different from an American Revolution that was meant to restore an antecedent state, and a French Revolution that's meant to really tear everything up root and branch.
I mean, one impressive thing about Burke, and I don't just based on reading your account of him, which is somewhat Moynihan follows in this, I think, is, I mean, people forget that the Reflections on the Revolution in France is written so early. I mean, it's one thing after the terror and the guillotine and Robespierre and the collapse of Napoleon to say, well, that really went badly, and it was always intrinsic or likely that it would go in this direction because of this flaw or that flaw. But Burke writes that book when things look like it's not obvious it's going to go in that direction, and he sees that that's the spirit of it, though.
That's right, and I think what he
1790,
sees,
I guess the book
1790,
just a year into it.
He calls it metaphysical madness. He refers to metaphysical madness. And I think what he sees in particular is that a philosophical politics on the model of a Rousseau or certainly even more of a Voltaire is intrinsically not only inclined but destined to become unhinged because it can't understand, it can't accept, and it is inherently hostile to the idea of moderation and limitation.
And liberty, ultimately, right?
In liberty, if you're Rousseau is an excellent example of this. And it's the same debate we're having today again over progress. If you're standing in the way of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and these abstract ideals that, as Martin Diamond noted, there's no point at which you sort of cross the goal line and spike the ball and say you've achieved those. What you have is a recipe for permanent violence.
And what about today? So let's conclude with that. Since we've discussed it some ourselves, I mean, in other contexts, how possible is it to restore or have an updated version of a Burkean understanding, a Moynihan-like understanding on both left and right? I'd be curious about your just judgments as we sit here in, mid-June 2019.
Right. I think the most alarming thing about our politics today is the lack, not only the lack of, but the hostility to nuance. So in Moynihan's rewriting of Kennedy's inaugurally, one of the opening lines was, "Things are complicated over here," right? And we don't. It's, you blame it on technology or social media or whatever else, but we don't deal in nuance in the same way, and we are, I would say, outright hostile to the idea of limitation, the idea that there are limits to everything, to what we can accomplish. That said, I don't think Moynihan was ever a despairing person, and Burke perhaps more so. Toward the end of his life, he asked to be buried in an unmarked grave because he was convinced the Jacobins were going to march across England and come for his remains, and so forth. But I think we have to be able to find a way to recapture the idea of complexity. And that's hard to do in 140 characters or 280 characters, whatever it is now.
And what about, I mean, the liberal, I guess, what would you say to both, to people who are inclined in the liberal direction and people who are inclined in the conservative direction in terms of sort of substantively how to come back to this? I mean, obviously, they should read Moynihan, they should read Burke,
they should read Moynihan,
read your
Burke.
books.
They should they should buy my books. That's the key stuff.
That's the key stuff. Then they can go read all the Moynihan, Moynihan's
That's
19 books, right?
I think I would say respect for what you don't know, which is have respect for what you don't know, which is not something we're very good at these days.
Yeah.
It's not. It's very hard to run for president or for Congress on a platform of prudence. I mean, as you know, George Bush, H.W. Bush was mocked mercilessly for saying things wouldn't be prudent, and I'm not aware of a president since then using that term. But it's
interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
It's a very rich and vital concept that we've completely lost. I mean, I use the example with students of the difference between the sort of visionary leadership for which we have an endless appetite and governance, sort of prudent governance. Some moments call for transformation, but some moments call for chugging along.
And even the moments that call for transformation to be successful requires prudence. Whether
prudence,
it's George Washington or Lincoln or
right. Lincoln gave a wonderful speech early in his when he was 29 years, maybe 29 years old, to the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, in which he said the greatest danger to American liberty would come from the pursuit of greatness in times that did not require it. That's my paraphrase, but which of course is ironic because his times eventually required greatness. But there's a profound concept of prudence there, that you have to calibrate statesmanship to the circumstances of the times, and you can't among the 20 some odd Democrats running for president, of course they're all staunchly opposed to Trumpism, but if you can imagine a more normal environment, you don't stand out on that stage by saying, well, we'll keep kind of things running along and I'll govern and solve problems and so on and so forth. You have to promise something transformative to stand out.
Yeah, even just saying I did sponsor this legislation which actually has improved lives in this way, or as governors and mayors do it a little more because they have had executive positions, but even I'm curious to see how many of them cite actual achievements in the real world or even proposals framed in terms of real effects and achievements, as opposed to, as you say, a kind of promise that's abstract and theoretical.
Well, and that abstraction was what was most troubling to Burke about the French Revolution, and what distinguishes it in many ways from the American Revolution. The American Revolution has a specific, achievable goal. Right? The French Revolution, it's when have you achieved fraternity? It's hard to know that, so it becomes a license for endless revolution. There's a reason the Cuban regime is calling itself a revolution after 60 years or whatever it's been.
But as someone like me on the conservative or Republican side all these years, it's more shocking to have conservatism abandon this perhaps than liberalism, which one could have always said had a certain tendency away from prudence, and progressives have been around a long time, and there was always that element of utopianism on the left that I guess there was some on the right, but one would have, I don't know, that part for me is even more, it shows I guess how strong some of these tendencies in modern thought and modern life are away from any kind of, as you say, moderation, prudence, respect for just forms, due process, all those sorts of things.
The forms in particular, Moynihan was quite an institutionalist with respect, not only with respect to the Senate, but with respect to the presidency, because he had served in the executive branch so long. And we have no, the Senate, the ambition is no longer counteracting ambition. The Congress has no interest in recovering its power over tariffs. It's quite striking to me that Mitch McConnell says his greatest legacy will be the confirmation of judges who are serving in another branch of government.
Right. And what are they doing? I mean, if you think about it for a minute, leaving aside resolving cases between private parties, which is fine, but what they're doing from a sort of constitutional point of view is what? I mean, you think if you're a senator, you would want to be resolving a lot of those things yourself one way or the other, checking a president or passing legislation.
Right, unless, and I'm not saying this of McConnell, but unless you want the job to have the job, not to do the work,
which you don't get blamed for certain things. You know.
Right. So if you can ask the federal district judge to remake the local school system or the local water system or whatever else, you can complain about it without having to
check
the
the left by through the courts, but not have to win the political fights.
Right.
I mean, and not have to disappoint a lot of constituents or antagonize them, I suppose. Now, it's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought of that, how odd that is as a formulation for a majority leader of the Senate with the president of his own party.
Right.
You know, thinking the best thing we can do is, put people in another branch. But to do what? The judges don't do anything affirmative, so they're stopping some things, I suppose. But I don't know. Isn't it better to win elections and stop things that way? You'd think.
Right.
And do you think? I'm just curious about this. I mean, if Moynihan liberalism, Burkean conservatism, the two together, Burkean liberalism, Moynihan conservatism, which worries you? I mean, do you think the way they would reassert themselves in America is through each of the parties? Does that remain? Do you think the route, Moynihan was a Democrat, even though he worked in Republican administrations, or could you imagine the parties going off in this progressive direction on the one hand, and I don't know what you want to call it, populist, kind of authoritarian direction on the other with Trump, and a kind of centrist, party that used to not really exist, but informally exist in a sense, right, with Moynihan and Packwood, or Moynihan working for Nixon, and that kind of across the aisle. I don't know. The system, I guess, is set up to so strongly favor two parties.
It is. It is. Of course, those parties have become vehicles for different things over different periods of time. One of the striking things to me about the institutions is how long the Senate made it on institutional culture, which has collapsed. But it's really there's Aristotle talks about this that in Burke as well that it's and Tocqueville and so forth, that it's the norms that sustain the institutions much more than the words you write down on parchment, as Madison would have said. So those are the genies that are hardest, I think, to put back in the bottle. We're often, Burke referred to the all-atoning name of liberty. And in Trump's case, it's the all-atoning name of judges, right? That anything else he does is okay because he's got the judges in the right place. So if you like all the Trump judges, and I like many of them, say they're going to transform the courts for 30 years, 40 years. Judges come and go and taxes rise and fall. Norms are very hard to put back once you've shown that they can be disrupted without consequence. So that legacy, I fear, will outlast whatever else has been done.
And one does wonder whether to put that back, you'd almost need a coalition government. We don't have those in America, but in a parliamentary system, one might say, just as in World War II, there was an actual coalition government, and in Burke's time, actually, in response to the French Revolution at times, right? That maybe that would be somehow a way to kind of. It's hard to see how working within either party, a Moynihan liberal what would he do in today's Democratic Party, or what would
Well, I think in today's Democratic Party, we're seeing in some ways a revival of the new left, the auction mentality that no enemies to the left and so on and so forth. And
in the Republican Party, something analogous.
Right.
The new right, if you want to call it that.
Right. And I'm often asked, could Moynihan be elected today? And Moynihan is so unique that I want to say yes. He just the sheer flair and uniqueness and depth and whatnot. But boy, it's hard to imagine Moynihan in 280 characters.
But I think he couldn't be. It was a tough election in '76. He won the Democratic primary by 1 percentage point over Bella Abzug, who attacked him, among many other things. For the Moynihan Report and for this and that, but actually for serving for Nixon. Think of that. Could you win a primary in a liberal state, moderately liberal state, in the Democratic Party if you had served in the George W. Bush administration, which would be the equivalent in 28 years after you'd served. So because if you ran in 2016 and you had served in the administration of the other party. Well, I guess we got a little test of this with
Jim Webb was
Right, or people who had served a little bit in other administrations. But I just think it's become so, don't you think, so partisan, and that would be almost like a knockout blow if you had been George W. Bush's domestic policy advisor and then you ran for the Democratic nomination for Senate.
Right.
That would just be such a devastating attack line. And
similarly,
the other way, I mean, obviously,
Right.
I guess Huntsman had this, didn't he? Huntsman, when he ran in 2012 for the Republican nomination for president, I think it served Obama for 2 years as ambassador to China. And it was one reason, among others, but I mean, that he just was sort of, well, he's like a friend of Obama, so you can't nominate him.
Right. I forget who I don't know when this began, but I forget who the congressman from Rhode Island was who told the story that he used to play basketball in the house gym with members of, with whoever, pick up basketball, whoever came by. And supposedly Gingrich called him in 96 or 95 it would have been, and said that's the end of that. And that if you recall, in 95, Gingrich put out the list of words to use it was like George Carlin's list of words to use to describe your opponent, and it was despicable, grotesque, and so forth. It's not to date it to Gingrich, but the partisanship, and I would say not just the partisanship, the polarization, but the attachment to personality, I think is really foreign to the American, the structure of the American regime.
Yeah, I just wonder more than I would have 2 years ago whether you need almost an extraordinary, independent candidacy in 2024. I don't know, I'm just making this up, obviously, or, a unity ticket almost at some point to really try to break through the current bizarre kind of gridlock of hyperpolarization, which those things don't usually go together, or oscillation of hyperpolarization, I suppose, is a better way of putting it.
Well, historically in America, new parties arise from single issues with intensity, and then they broaden from there. So the Republican Party would be the classic example of that. And as you say, the incentives for a two-party system are so strongly built in that it's interesting that the insurgency that you would expect of an independent candidate was really Trump, and he had to capture the Republican Party in order to pull it off. I mean, if only for the infrastructure.
Yeah, I guess. Well, who knows? I mean, it's everything else. Things are so up in the air, and Trump was so unusual, not to say unprecedented, that maybe one can imagine other things happening that would be pretty unusual. And I think Moynihan would probably tell us that. Don't assume things will go on. He had seen a lot of reversals and
and I think he would say despair is a sin, right? It's does you no good, and there's a lot of inertia behind the basic premises of the American system. So I wouldn't say I'm sanguine, but I'm less concerned than many that things are completely falling apart.
That's a great note. That's what has to pass for optimism in our day.
Right, that's right.
You're less concerned
not
than
completely.
You're
not
less
completely.
concerned than many that things are totally and completely falling apart.
Right.
Greg Weiner, thanks for this very interesting discussion
of
mostly Pat Moynihan, but also Edmund Burke, and people should look at those books, and then they should go read Moynihan. I've totally forgotten about the introduction to the Coping book, which I think may be in print, but anyway, that really is worth going back to look at. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on Conversations.